Hey, what's up guys, welcome back. So in this video we're going to be talking about Arnold-Chiari-malformation, and we're going to discuss type 1, 2 and 3, and hopefully we're going to go through it very quickly in less than 5 minutes. So remember that these videos aren't aimed at describing or explaining the pathogenesis and the symptoms in a lot of detail. Rather, it's just here to kind of make sense out of the condition, so that when you do go study it, it will make a lot of sense and you just go through it much quicker. Okay, so Arnold-Chiari-malformation is one of those conditions that come up a lot in neurology, especially in exams. They're not that common in real life, but in med school they do come up in exams. So I had a lot of trouble understanding this or remembering it over time, because I didn't really make sense out of the condition. So what you need to understand is that Arnold-Chiari-malformation essentially is a small posterior cranial fossa. Just remember it as that. Arnold-Chiari-malformation, small posterior cranial fossa. And here, okay, this is a normal posterior cranial fossa. Okay, there's a lot of space here. Okay, but for some reason in a Chiari malformation, okay, there is a smaller posterior cranial fossa. In other words, there's less space in the posterior skull, and for some reason this occurs. It can be for different reasons, and it basically causes compression on the structures. It causes compression. It pushes everything, because obviously if there's no space, things are going to be squished together. So if you want to understand the condition in a logical way, just understand it step by step. So there's a small cranial fossa for some reason. Okay, it could be congenital. In other words, you could be born with it, or it could be acquired. You could, for some reason, have a tumor in the posterior cranial fossa that compresses the structures, but essentially the cranial fossa has less space, the posterior cranial fossa. And what that does is that it will push the cerebellum and the brainstem, sometimes only the cerebellum, sometimes only the brainstem, sometimes both of them. And it does this because, as we said, there's no space. So what does this mean? So this means that you're going to get symptoms to do with compression of the brainstem and the cerebellum. It's quite simple. These conditions that have like these long names, they can seem complicated, but in this case, it's quite a simple. It's a logical explanation. It's easy to understand. Small cranial fossa. Things are going to get pushed because there's no space, and then you're going to get symptoms of compression. Okay, so what is causing the small cranial fossa? Why is there a small cranial fossa? So remember we said that it could be something that's congenital. It can be something that you're born with. So in other words, the cranial bone, that posterior aspect of the skull, did not develop properly, so it was too small, and that's what's causing the compression of the cerebellum or maybe the brainstem. Or it could be something that's acquired. So maybe a patient has a tumor, and that's taking up the space. Or another example could be chronic meningitis, so where you've got fibrosis that's pushing structures in the posterior cranial fossa. So here is what it looks like. So this is a normal cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa here. So let's say that this is the posterior aspect. So there's a lot of space for the cerebellum, but maybe the patient was born abnormally, or he has a mass in the posterior aspect, and what that does is that it pushes all of these structures down towards the foramen magnum. Okay, so here you can see the cerebellar tonsils are within the skull, but because there's no space here, the cerebellar tonsils are being pushed down the foramen magnum, and it's compressing the spinal cord. And we'll see later that it can cause a syrinx, which is associated with syringomyelia. So here you can see a posterior view. So here are your tonsils that are being pushed down the foramen magnum. Okay, so what's the difference between Arnold-Chiari-malformation type 1, 2, and 3? So essentially, it's what structures are being pushed down the foramen magnum. So in type 1, you've only got the cerebellar tonsils that are being pushed down. So this would be a type 1 Arnold-Chiari-malformation because it's only the tonsils of the cerebellum that are being pushed down. In type 2, it's only the brainstem that's being pushed down. And in type 3, which is severe and serious, both the cerebellar tonsils and the brainstem are being pushed down the foramen magnum. So in this last step, we said here, so basically we just talked about which structures, okay, are going to be pushed down. So now we have to ask ourselves, okay, so what symptoms are going to be produced? And the answer is basically the symptoms are associated with whatever structures are being compressed. So whatever's being pushed down the foramen magnum is going to be compressed, and you're going to get symptoms associated with that. Now you can go and study the symptoms in detail and hopefully it will make sense, but you can kind of make logical sense out of it. If the cerebellar tonsils are being pushed down and the cerebellum is being compressed, obviously you're going to get problems like dizziness. You might get problems associated with coordination, because these are coordination and movement, because these are things that the cerebellum is responsible for. Okay, so now what are the two most important conditions to remember that are associated with Arnold-Chiari-malformation? Now these come up in exams a lot. So essentially they are meningeomyelocele and syringomyelia. Now I'm not going to explain these in a lot of detail. You can go and study them by yourself, or hopefully you already know them. But the way that I kind of remember their association with Arnold-Chiari-malformation is that Arnold-Chiari-malformation is essentially a compression of the posterior structures in the brain, right? Now, meningeomyelocele is essentially like a malformation of the spine that pushes structures out of its original anatomical positions. So that's easy for me, that I can create an association there. That might not be exactly why it's associated with, but it's an easy way to understand it. And in the same way, in syringomyelia, basically, if this is your spinal cord, okay, if this is your spine, in your spinal canal, okay, is where the problem is. It basically gets stretched out, it gets dilated. It could be due to a lot of different reasons. It could be due to things like tumors, it could be due to directly caused by Arnold-Chiari-malformation, but essentially it's a stretching out of the spinal canal. So again, it's kind of a structural abnormality, so it's easy to make that association. So you can just remember these and try and make your individual links to Arnold-Chiari-malformation. So hopefully I haven't gone over 5 minutes. So the main point of the video essentially is that Arnold-Chiari-malformation is a small posterior fossa. It could be something that you're born with, or it could be it could be something you're born with here, or it could be acquired, something like a tumor. okay, that's taking up space in the posterior cranial fossa, and that leads to no space. This means that there's going to be structures that are going to be pushed through the foramen magnum, and you're going to get symptoms associated with compression. So I hope that made sense. I hope a light bulb went off. So if it did help you, please do like and subscribe. I would really appreciate that. And again, if you have any kind of suggestions for medical topics that you want me to cover, I don't mind. You can just comment below. And yeah, thanks a lot.